you can effectively invite philanthropy to the table and say, hey, we're a step ahead of you. We thought about this. And from positions of strength, we have engaged in a strategic plan that's going to allow us to be more efficient and more impactful. But we need an investment in order to do this well.
Welcome to the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange, a podcast from IPM Advancement. We believe strong nonprofits can change the world, and our goal with each episode is to bring you insightful conversations with thought leaders from the nonprofit sector. Let's get started.
Welcome, listeners, to the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange. I'm your host, Rich Frazier. Today, we're digging into some of the big picture questions facing the nonprofit sector, questions that we can no longer ignore. What does it mean to be a nonprofit today, and why is the sector so reliant on public funding? How did we reach a point where so many organizations feel underfunded, under attack, and uncertain about the future? The challenges we're seeing, from recent threats to government grants to a growing reliance on major donors and the struggle to engage next-gen philanthropists, they didn't come out of nowhere. They're rooted in deeper systemic issues, and they raise fundamental questions about the role of nonprofits in society. To help us unpack this, I'm joined by three thoughtful guests. Together, we'll talk about how we got here, what's changing, and where the sector might go next. Let's meet our panel. First up, Melissa Cowley-Wolf is a regular guest on the show. She's the founder of MCW Projects and a leading voice in building philanthropic engagement across generations. Her work centers on inspiring next-gen donors and shifting how we think about giving and impact. Melissa, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much. Fun to be back with you all.
Next is Patton Hindle. She's the executive director of Artadia, a national grant maker for artists, and she is an arts leader and consultant whose work spans nonprofit management, strategy, and advocacy. She brings a creative lens to reimagining how nonprofits operate in today's environment. Patton, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
And finally, George Suttles, a senior leader and recognized expert on the intersection of philanthropy, racial equity, and nonprofit finance. He's passionate about helping the sector confront its toughest challenges. George, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Melissa, I'd like to start with you. When we say the nonprofit sector is facing an existential crisis, is it really about funding, or is it something deeper about the role nonprofits play in our society, the way nonprofits are set up? What are we talking about?
Well, Rich, thank you so much for giving us time and space to talk about this very big issue. And first of all, I just want to say that you all at NPFX have done a fabulous job of covering the recent news and the funding shifts. So I want to encourage listeners to go back and listen to some prior episodes, which cover things ranging from how nonprofits can double down on advocacy, should double down on stewardship and storytelling, and more. So this is a piece of that, of a larger series. So I encourage everyone to check that out. So I like to say there's a war happening on nonprofits. I'll say it. How else to explain the drastic funding cuts that we're seeing, the move to tax foundations, rules to regulate how nonprofits working in certain areas can work, the pending changes that'll happen within the tax sphere to charitable gifts. So there is a lot happening now that is going to change the landscape as we know it. But additionally, it's been kind of pending for a while. We've been on these parallel tracks of an over-reliance on public and government funding and moving towards a massive generational transfer of wealth that is happening in the world, the largest transfer that's ever happened. And our research shows that next-gen donors have a very different view of institutions, of nonprofits, and of philanthropy. So these two things have kind of hit a point where they've collided together. And we have been very reliant on grant makers and public funding, really at the expense of not building stronger relationship-based individual giving programs. And now we're in a situation where, yes, an existential crisis is happening because what we have been relying on in terms of our funding is being threatened. And so the nonprofit sector itself is going to undergo massive shifts. And we need to make up for some lost time in terms of how are we working with individuals and messaging with individuals to support the work that we do. We could go into a lot of reports that have just come out, the Giving USA report, as well as the UBS Global Wealth Report. Top line, I will just say that there is a lot of money out there, especially in America. We added 1,000 new millionaires every day last year to the American economy. And the Giving USA report shows that people are exceptionally charitable and that we had a record-breaking year last year in terms of American philanthropy. So there's a lot of money out there with individuals, corporations, and foundations. They are all giving at record levels. And so we really have to develop practices where we engage with our communities much better to get our nonprofit sector that is so needed well-funded.
Thank you. Patton.
I mean, I think I would add in, so Melissa's point, we are at this nexus, and I'll speak also, I should say, more predominantly from a background of the arts and culture funding. But within that sector, we nearly went under in COVID. And then unfortunately, all this money, fortunately or unfortunately, I say unfortunately, all this money flew out of the government and flew from the private sector into organizations, and organizations never reassessed the work that they were doing. They kept on with business as normal. Maybe they weren't having exhibitions because people couldn't attend them. So they were replacing that with virtual programming. But the cadence just kept going and no one took a pause to really think about why were we actually teetering on the edge when this moment hit? And what should we be doing there? So I feel like us now being back in this place again is really showing that we didn't take the space to think and learn from that moment. We just kept carrying forward.
George.
Yeah, no, thanks. Melissa provided a lot of great context, but I keep wanting to hearken back to sort of the historical underpinnings of how nonprofits currently operate. And so this now inextricable link between government funding and nonprofits is something that wasn't meant to be, right? If you look at the history of civil society and associational life, nonprofits were meant to be a key component of civil society that existed outside of government and the markets.
Yeah.
And so when we started linking government funding to nonprofit infrastructure into programming, we began to sort of pull away from that. And so that's something that I just keep hearkening back to, is that in reality, the nonprofit sector was never meant to be so linked to government funding in the way that we experience it now. So how do we move forward and think about those historical sort of underpinnings and try to get back to an era where the nonprofit sector is promoting the public good, promoting democratic practice outside of government and the markets, so that we do have that freedom and independence that we were meant to, as a key sort of lever of associational life and of civil society more broadly.
Well, also, George, the other funny thing is that how many organizations in the last 30 years are responding to the fact that there were governmental cuts in a certain field. So they were going in to replace the government, but then started taking money from the government. And I will say my organization is one of those. We were funded by the NEA, but we were founded in response to the NEA cutting direct funding to artists. So we filled in to supplement what the government was doing, but then we started becoming reliant on the government to also fund our work.
Right. No, that's a really good point. I mean, the nonprofit sector was always meant to supplement, not supplant.
Yeah.
And so we've created these perverse incentives and this misalignment connected to funding and sort of the role that nonprofits play in our society. And that's where sort of we are now. That's why trust is down. And it's been a key initiative of this administration to effectively dismantle a vibrant U.S. nonprofit sector, because the nonprofit sector is connected to democratic practice. So we begin to see how all the puzzle pieces fit. And then we're like, oh, right. We look back in history and we're like, oh, actually, nonprofits were meant to be parallel to government and hold government accountable and allow us to more deeply connect interpersonally as we share values and transmit, sort of good social practice to each other. So it's become quite messy once we've allowed government to fuel a key part of civil society that was actually meant to hold it accountable.
So if we look at the nonprofit business model, is this an existential crisis, or is it a long overdue reckoning of a system that's been stretched far too thin for far too long?
I think that's right. Rich, to the extent that that there is a need for a reckoning. I'm less convinced that the reckoning should be focused on just the sector. I think it's like
I agree with you.
I'd be interested in zooming out and saying, like, I think we need to reckon with it all, right? Just the way sort of how all of this is set up. Because for me, when I think about the public good, I think about progressive tax reform first. Before I even think about nonprofit sector, I think about philanthropy, right? So it's like, if there's going to be a reckoning, what are the fundamental questions that we need to interrogate? How do we take care of our people? And if that is one of the foundational fundamental questions, to your point, Rich, the reckoning might be, is engaging with nonprofits the best way to do that? And the answer might be yes, and the answer might be no. And so if there's going to be a reckoning, I just want to make sure we're asking ourselves the right questions in order to get to answers that are going to be sustainable and make sure that we can honor the essence of the work that we all care about in the nonprofit sector, which is to take care of people.
Well, let's talk about how we take care of our people. Let's talk about how we invest in nonprofits, because we can't do with shoestring budgets. We can't be over reliant on government funds. We're talking about the huge transfer of wealth to the next gen philanthropists. And Melissa, you mentioned that they're looking for something different than mom and dad were looking for when investing in nonprofits. So what are they looking for? And what do we need to show next gen philanthropists?
That's a great question. And it comes right from what George said about trust and the perception of nonprofits and the reckoning around the business model. I mean, I think this is a moment ripe for opportunity. You know, that old saying, every crisis is an opportunity. But we know from research that I want to say emerging philanthropists, rising philanthropists, those that are stepping into their philanthropic maturity now, which happens more and more every day and aligned with this massive growth of wealth and millionaires that I mentioned. There is a real desire there to look at business as usual, to look at the models that we've created and say, do these models need to change? And how can I participate through my work, through my volunteerism, through my mission-driven life, and through my philanthropic investment to change those systems? Meanwhile, you have a nonprofit sector that is encountering this reckoning we're talking about. So there's a huge opportunity there to connect and to figure out together and be in dialogue and conversation with these emerging generations of, as George said, how can we best take care of our people? And how can those, the nonprofit structures that have been built, and we're talking about mission-driven work, we're talking about service and mission-driven work, and how can we take that ethos and make it better in what we do? Because trust in nonprofits is down. It's higher than corporations and government, according to a lot of studies, but it's still down. And about 50% of those surveyed say they trust the work that nonprofits are doing. And is it impactful? Is it effective? And where does the money go? So there's, I think, a really great moment now to align our desire to remake our businesses and our business model in the nonprofit world, and the funders that are out there who are interested in examining what systems change could look like, and who are keenly interested in tackling the issues that we're encountering as a democratic society.
Does that kind of go back to what you were talking about, Patton, about lessons learned during COVID? How do we do what we do better, smarter?
Yeah, I think there's two things that are happening to me in parallel that I find funny. So if we think about the next generation of donor, and then to George's point, we talk about how are we taking care of our people? That is what nonprofits do. They take care of communities, and that is inherent in the work. But and that's what the next generation donor wants, that connectivity. Like, they want to understand that work. They don't understand these big, massive structures around them or where their money is flowing necessarily when they contribute into them. And so there's a lack of transparency there. But on the flip side, with the next generation of cultural worker, let's say, or nonprofit worker, you have what we have is a systemic problem in development where no one can hire a good development director or someone who doesn't need coaching at the very least. And that person is trained in their mind because of maybe because they've grown up in front of a screen to sit behind the screen, to never be the person going out and meeting their community. And that could be the constituents of who they're serving, but that flies right back into philanthropy, meeting and talking to the people who are going to be your donors, listening to them, hearing what they're interested in. And so there's this sort of weird mixture where it's like, you join a nonprofit because you care about taking care of an issue. Like there is deep support and interest in an issue or a cause or an individual community. But then you're not doing the flip side of that work philanthropically, of listening to the people who want to give to support the work, listening to people who are trying to figure out how to invest in the system that you're trying to build. And so there's something that's just like missed the mark in there. And this is, Melissa and I have talked about this deeply of this hiding behind a screen. George, I don't know if this comes up in your work at all, if you're starting to see parallels in this too, but it would be interesting to know, like even from a larger philanthropic sector, if they notice that there's some sort of generational divide starting to happen in the workforce.
George.
I will say, Pat, there are a couple of things that you shared that really resonate with me. One, I do think there are real generational circumstances that we need to understand as fundraisers in order to engage this next generation of philanthropists. So I definitely do see differences in the way next gen philanthropists understand impact, want it measured, the way they want to connect with institutions, and sometimes not connect with institutions. So to Melissa's point, if trust is down, but the desire to be philanthropic is up, they're looking for alternative mechanisms for social impact. And so how do we think about that and partner with next gen philanthropists in particular and say, okay, I understand what you want, and how do we create an experience that's both aligned with the work and also fulfills that deep desire for impact in the way that you want to engage with it? That's one. The second thing is, I think that when we talk about philanthropy in the context of individual donors, and I've seen this in research that I've done and also in my role as a philanthropic advisor in a previous professional life, is that we still subscribe to a certain profile of philanthropist. When we think of philanthropy and philanthropists, and I will say the likes of Mackenzie Scott really have begun to shift who we believe are philanthropists. And when I say philanthropists, those that can cut meaningful checks to support social impact work, to support organizations. But philanthropy at its essence should and is accessible to all. The person who volunteers 10 hours a week at their local community-based nonprofit organization, if we want to follow a pure definition of philanthropy, they are being philanthropic. They are moving in the world as a philanthropist. And so I think that could potentially be part of it too, right? Is when we think about this 85 or $90 trillion great wealth transfer, there's also a whole community of folks who can be engaged in a way that could be equally as impactful to our nonprofit organizations and to the sector more broadly. So how do we sort of engage the folks who have a lot of money, either currently or coming their way, and engage with folks who care about the work and have a passion for it, and provide pathways and opportunities for them to engage just as meaningfully, right? So I think it's an and both proposition. And I just want to, bring that into the space.
I feel like you're seeing that more and more and more. I'll say like from a board level, where you're now having boards who are considered, like I sit on two boards, George and I are on a board together, but I sit on two boards that very much have the mindset of, yes, we need you to contribute within your means, but we also need you to work. Like we need you to be a working board. So when I think about my philanthropy, which is small because I also lead a nonprofit, so we know I'm not rolling in money here.
You're not one of the 1,000 new millionaires from last year?
Unfortunately not. No, I wish. But I think that I look at the ways that I can contribute, and that is like strategy, skill set, expertise, networking, other ways that help build and strengthen the nonprofits within which that I choose to serve on the boards. But you need that mixture. On all of those boards, you need that mixture of the person who also can cut those big, significant checks alongside. And you're going to find the needle in the haystack of the person who can do both at once. And there are very few and far of those. But I do think that we're starting to see that transition even at the highest level within some nonprofits. I'd say some forward-thinking nonprofits.
Hi, this is Curtis Schmidt, producer of the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange. If you're a nonprofit professional who has questions about your program, or maybe you feel like you've taken your advocacy, fundraising, or membership effort as far as you can and you need some fresh ideas, then we have a special offer for you today. NPFX podcast listeners can get a free 30-minute consultation with IPM Advancement, no strings attached, when you go to ipmadvancement.com/free. Just enter a few details and an IPM team member will contact you to follow up. It's that easy. That website again is ipmadvancement.com/free. Thanks for listening, and we hope to talk to you soon. Now let's return to the episode.
Let me ask about engaging next-gen philanthropists. Since we're talking about individual donors here, and particularly this transfer of wealth, and I'm wondering if you all have seen in your practice ever run across sort of the mismatch between what funders want to fund and what communities actually need.
I mean, yes, just to say absolutely yes. Again, I'm going to take this, but from an arts and culture perspective, because that is like the field within which I practice.
Yeah.
But I'm seeing a lot of distrust in cultural institutions, meaning museums right now. And I will say, when you talk to a next generation donor, which, our donor base at my organization has started shifting younger because we don't have this physical structure around us. They can see the money is transparently flowing through us out into the hands of people, and they get to meet those people. So there's a very clear delineation of where the money is going. On the contrary, I'm hearing that within cultural institutions, a lot is coming out about pay scale inequity amongst these very highly paid executive directors down to, let's say, the curator of an exhibition. And the person who's supporting a younger donor who is supporting a cultural institution may be doing so because of an artist that they care about, a curator they care about, not really necessarily the person at the top. And so when those discrepancies, let's say in pay or care for the staff, are elucidated in a very public way, it's a big turnoff, because then they're questioning, well, I've been sending this money to this organization every year, a significant contribution. How much of that is actually going to the place that I want it to go to? How much of it is supporting? And am I seeing tangible change within pay scale, benefits, care for workers? They want to see a much more equitable system. And unfortunately, historically, our nonprofit system has very much been modeled after the capitalist structure within which we work, where people at the top are being paid exceptionally well. This is, again, I'll speak from the arts, but people at the top are being paid exceptionally well. And then when you go down to the people who are really laboring to put on the exhibitions, the things that communities see, they are not being compensated well, which is why there's been a large unionization effort within the field too over the last 6 years or so.
Melissa.
I want to just add to what Patton said about the money flowing directly to the artist. We see nonprofits that are very successful in their individual fundraising among next generation donors. Those who have a program where you can very clearly see where the money is going. So as George mentioned, measuring impact and being transparent. But also there is something so powerful about especially next generation donors, to know that their money is going directly to the individual who is the change maker or is doing the work in the community or is moving the needle. We see this in politics. We see huge investment in time, energy, volunteering in younger generations. They are very engaged in advocacy because they see the direct results if they are supporting a candidate or supporting a cause. So people really want to see their money go to someone who is making a change, someone who is moving the needle. And the more that organizations can show that, I think the more effective they will be at their philanthropy.
How do we show that?
Well, first of all, I think it all comes down to your mission and your core programming. Do you have a mission, and is your core program directly aiding the community that you have chosen to serve? So it all goes back to mission, but also it requires radical transparency in showing how things are funded. From the minute that dollar comes in the door to the minute it goes out, or if it stays in, why does it stay in? And I think the nonprofit sector has done a very poor job of articulating the philanthropic business model, why we have this business model and what it means, and how we do rely on dollars to not just fulfill our mission and serve our communities, but we need to pay folks. We need to keep the lights on. There is not a separate fund for that. We are not getting that big check from the sky that keeps our lights on. So I think demystifying that and being transparent about that, but that also means we have to be very, very, very clear within our own organizations of where we are allocating our dollars, so that we can be transparent. But the transparency is the crucial part here.
George, I want to go back. Take a couple steps back. We find ourselves in this spot where there is a lot of defunding of government funds. We're over-reliant on government funds right now. What's this transition period look like to you or nonprofits over the next X number of years? And I don't know what X equals. What does that look like? How do we become less dependent on government funds? How do we become more trustworthy in the communities that we serve? How do we grow trust with the next gen philanthropists when we've had that conversation for the last few minutes? But what's that whole transition period look like? How do we navigate that?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the opportunity to grapple with that complex and very multidimensional question. I think first, and both Patton and Melissa have both alluded and explicitly sort of named this, it's this issue of trust. And I want to reflect really quickly on something that Patton said. We've got a next generation donor that we want to connect with and we want to bring into the nonprofit sector as a partner. But we also have a next generation of nonprofit leadership that is willing to do a couple of things. One, admit that the sector isn't perfect. Patton mentioned, you come in as a nonprofit leader and you're like, wow, like there's pay inequity. There's all of these other things that have been perpetuated that aren't great. And so how do we reinstate trust in our organization and institution? By doing some internal work. So I'm really encouraged by this next generation of nonprofit leaders that are like, hey, like the nonprofit sector, this organization in particular is very valuable. There's good work for us to do. But we've got to be transparent about some of those missteps and then engage in partnership around transformational change. And so I think there really can be an opportunity to engage in what some might call radical transparency and say, hey, I know this isn't perfect. Partner with me to help me. I need resources to make these shifts and engage in this change. And that can become an invitation that I think could be appealing and compelling to donors, especially next gen donors that get it and will say, okay, changes need to be made. I'm more than willing to partner with you on this transformation. Like let's make things better than they were. So I think that invitation could be a part of the transformation and the new opportunity that we have. I also think that we're going to see, and I have no emotional sensibility around this, but I do think we're going to see nonprofit closures. I think we're going to see like mergers and acquisitions. I think we're going to see strategic partnerships that may or may not have been engaged in before we were in this, in this moment. But I think this crisis is going to accelerate those conversations. Like, hey, nonprofit A does this work, nonprofit B does this work. We're both struggling to raise money and we're struggling to survive these federal, state, and municipal budget cuts. Is there an opportunity for us to come together and keep the work alive in a way where our respective nonprofits might not exist anymore in terms of infrastructure, but we have merged into a new nonprofit organization that's more efficient, that's leaner, and that allows us to engage both communities and in philanthropy in a way that is sustainable. So I think you will...
And that's not a bad thing. We're diluting impact through fragmentation with so many nonprofits in the country right now.
Yeah, Rich, I think that's right. And I think... in my work, I always encourage those conversations from a position of strength.
Yeah.
I think that's just a part of like good governance hygiene, right? Is to say, hey, like, let's look at our constellation of nonprofit partners and see if there's an opportunity to strategically partner in a way that not only drives efficiency, but allows us to have more impact. And so even if you engage in that exploration from a position of strength, I've actually have found that you can effectively invite philanthropy, both from, the private side and also from the institutional side to the table and say, hey, we're a step ahead of you. Like we thought about this. And from positions of strength, we have engaged in a strategic plan that's going to allow us to connect in a way that's going to be more efficient and more impactful. But we need an investment in order to do this well. And so I have found that 2, 3, 4 nonprofits that do that work from positions of strength have been quite successful in engaging in philanthropy in a meaningful way. So, Rich, to your point, I don't think it's a bad thing. It's just unfortunate that a moment of crisis has accelerated those conversations. So we have to sort of hurry up and figure out what this looks like to save not just organizations and programs, but then also careers and jobs, right?
Yeah.
So if we would have been more thoughtful, we could have created more of a runway to have those conversations and do it in a smart sort of thoughtful, careful way. But now it's kind of like we're in crisis. We've got to figure something out. How do we do that? So without taking up too much more time, those are sort of the two things. Is I think commensurate with next gen donors are incredibly savvy and sophisticated next gen nonprofit leaders that really have an opportunity to change the way we engage with philanthropy, and we invite them to have a seat at the table as partners to think about this transformation in a way that I think could be incredibly impactful. And then I also think we're just going to see closures, mergers, acquisitions. I think that's just a fact and we've already seen some of it. So
a lot of the next gen leaders that I know are working with organizations that are about a generation away from their founding. So the leaders now are not the founders. The leaders now are not those that created the organization. And I see a release of taking the ego out of it around conversations around mergers and closures. It doesn't mean you have failed. It means you want to be better and you want to be more impactful. And so encouraging leaders, myself and my colleagues, in especially in the arts and culture sector, really encouraging leaders to look at the opportunities and do some analysis around what could benefit the communities that we're serving and the sector should a merger happen, and also evaluating whether a closure is necessary. It doesn't mean you failed. There are a lot of reasons for closure and merger that aren't just, oh, we can't do this anymore. So I think inherent in the next gen leader is a little bit of the loss of the ego and the preciousness that only we in this one nonprofit with our five staff members can do this work. No, we can be better if we merge. We can be more impactful if we work together. And there is an essence of collaboration that I see both with the next gen leader and the next gen donor. And this is what George said so eloquently, is engaging in partnership around transformational change. That is what the next gen donor wants to do. How we are interested in this together. I'm interested, you're interested. You have the organization to do it. I have some contacts, some knowledge, some expertise, and the funding and the resources to help you do that. Let's do that together. And I see that also at the next gen leader level. So again, we had kind of a dress rehearsal. We've had two dress rehearsals for this moment. One was when the first Trump administration threatened to shift nonprofit funding. That did not happen. We then had COVID, which made us all question our practices. And then we went completely back to business as usual once we reopened the doors. And now we're having this third moment where it is real now, and we have to make some decisions. And I think the donors out there and I think the leaders out there are really primed to do it.
Patton, real quick, you wanted to jump in here, and then I have a question for each of you before we wrap.
I think just to carry off of what Melissa so beautifully said about, and George, engaging in partnership, it's also thinking about the structures within which we operate. So I think there's a more and more of an emergence happening of considering C4 models alongside having a C3. So what does it mean to advocate on behalf of your community truly and holistically? And is that something that also, it seems like, may speak more particularly to the need of a younger generational donor, where they are trying to really deepen social impact. They're trying to see the needle move and systems change. And the C3 model is equipped in many ways to do some of that, but it's not fully equipped to do it. So what are adjacencies? And a C4 doesn't have to be the only answer. People are also investigating, what does it mean to be a public benefit corporation or an L3C, like all of these lower models that still allow for profitability, but are trying to adhere to change. And I think we've been fortunate to have a bunch of these models emerge over the last, let's say, 15 years or so. And now we're seeing much more of an embrace of them in a way that I will say, like, half of the country was already doing, and the other half of the country probably wasn't engaging in as well as it should have.
Thank you, Patton. That was very insightful. Before we wrap up, I want to hear from each of you. What does a future-proof nonprofit look like?
I would say that a future-proof nonprofit is one that is engaged in a deep practice of listening and inquisition into their work, be it of the communities that they serve, but the people who are also supporting their work, and an ability to take calculated risk, to understand and experiment in a moment where I think we're not going to have one answer to this problem. I think if we're fortunate, we're going to have a myriad of different pathways for nonprofits to start to move towards. And that only happens by people taking a little risk and experimenting with something and not being afraid to have, and you can't see me, but putting air quotes around the word failure, because in my lens of work, nothing is a failure. It's like you may go A, B, C, P, back to B, but you're going to find your way to the end of the alphabet at some point in time. And you have to be able to be creative in your thinking.
Thank you, Patton. And I really appreciate the risk and the failure aspect of that. And in order to do that, you have to have freedom. And that means a board that allows you these things and donors who support you in those things. This is my PSA to the boards and the donors who are listening. George.
Yeah, no, that's a great PSA. And it's a great segue for sort of where my mind is going. I think if we're going to future-proof the nonprofit sector, we have to take donors out of the center.
Ooh.
Like, we have to think about what it means to effectively resource nonprofit institutions and organizations that are the life's blood of civil society. And so what does it look like for Pat, and I'll use your nonprofit. What does it look like for your institution or organization to be, flush with resources and then be able to totally reframe the invitation to donors and partners, right? To say, hey, like, this is amazing work that's happening. And so what I'm bringing to you is an opportunity to contribute and participate. That's a totally different conversation than, hey, like, your gift will allow us to do this, and your gift will privilege us to participate in these ways and support artists in these ways. Imagine being able to say, no, this work is funded, it's happening, but I'd love for you to be a part of it. Like, that's a totally different mindset, sensibility, and tact. And so to future-proof nonprofits, we have to figure out a way to appropriately over-resource them. If we believe nonprofits are important, as we've been saying, then the future of nonprofits looks like where starving them is unacceptable. Again, that's a totally different posture.
Yeah, I'd love to get us to the point where the donors are not at the center of it, that we are always focused on those that we serve first, and the donors get to be a part of serving that. 100% with you on that. Melissa.
I don't have anything to add because my colleagues here are so brilliant, but I will kind of summarize. I think a future-proof nonprofit engages in three processes. The first is listening to communities, to teams, just to the world. Listen to what the world is telling you. Second, a process of evaluation and analysis of the impact of the work that we're doing, so that, as Patton said, we can experiment and take calculated risk. And third, a process of partnership and collaboration with our boards, our communities, those we serve, and again, the world. How can we best partner and collaborate to drive impact, to make this work successful and make the world better?
Thank you, Melissa. It is almost time for us to go, but before we do, I want to ask each of you, what's one thing that you want listeners to take away from the conversation? It can be something that we've talked about or something that we haven't even covered yet. George.
I think for me, I would just leave listeners with a message of hope. We have to keep going, and it's going to be really, really important that we continue to not only fight to protect the sector, but we hold space for conversations like this that allow us to also reimagine the sector in ways that can be more impactful and vibrant.
Right on. Thank you. Patton.
I think in the lens of thinking about everybody's own individual power in this moment, considering the ways in which you can be philanthropic. So to what George noted earlier, philanthropy is not just money. It is time. It is support of an organization with your own individual resources. So think holistically that you are a philanthropist in your day-to-day activities.
Love that. Thank you, Patton. And Melissa.
I think it's really hard. I'm noticing it's really hard to vision right now. There's so much happening in the world. There's distraction, there's crises, there's putting food on the table, there's paying your staff and your team, there's sending your kids to a good, safe school. It's hard to vision right now, but I think this is an important moment to try to psychologically flip the crises of the nonprofit sector into a mindset of opportunity, and to engage people around you to listen and think through how things can change, and really invest in the time to do the strategic work right now so that we can move forward from a place of strength.
Thank you, Melissa. I want to thank Melissa Cowley-Wolf, Patton Hindle, and George Suttles for all your contributions today. One last thing, where can listeners find out more about you? Alyssa?
You can go to my website, which is mcw-projects.com.
Patton?
Also my website, pattonhindle.com.
And George?
You can find me on LinkedIn, or you can find me at a nonprofit near you, just trying to be helpful.
All right, George, thank you, my friend. What a great conversation today. Again, I want to say thank you to our guests. Thanks to our producer, Curtis Schmidt, and thank you to our listeners for tuning in. We'll see you next time on the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange.
That concludes this episode of the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange. Thanks to our panel for sharing their insights and expertise. If you'd like to learn more about our panel members or any of the organizations or resources featured in this episode, we will include links in the show notes. If you like this podcast, we would love your help spreading the word. First, please subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app so you always know when a new episode is released. Second, forward the episodes you like to friends and colleagues or share them on social media. Word of mouth is one of the best ways you can help us reach more nonprofit professionals like yourself. And if you use Apple Podcasts or Audible, please leave us a review. Positive reviews are how many listeners decide whether or not to try out a new podcast. We appreciate your help. For suggestions on topics, guests, or nonprofit organizations you'd like to hear on the podcast, send an email with the subject heading NPFX suggestion to contact@ipmadvancement.com. For back episodes and more resources like white papers, infographics, and blog articles, please visit the free IPM Advancement Nonprofit Resource Library at ipmadvancement.com/resources. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.